Welcome to another video. Tonight we have 5 stories. From tales involving cassette tapes, a winemaker, an old house, and much more. A huge thank you to all of tonight's authors. If you have a story of your own, it can be sent to reddit.com/r/slumberreads. These videos do take me quite a bit of time to create, so if you're feeling generous, and if you feel this video is worth one, please be sure to drop a like rating. It helps the channel more than most think. Subscribing if you're new is also greatly appreciated. Also, I started posting on my second channel again. I'm currently uploading more horror stories over there in an ASMR format. The channel is called NoSleep, and I will have a link for it in both the description and pinned comment if you're interested in checking it out. Anyway, enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Cassette tapes. My dad died 3 months ago, and we recently found out what he was leaving behind for us to inherit. My mother got the house, as was fair. She had cats to care for. Toby got Dad's car, a vintage Mercedes in mint condition, if you didn't count the root beer stain on the back seat. And what about me? What about his oldest son? Cassette tapes. I knew Dad was a strange man, only getting stranger with age. He wasn't that old when he died, just 52 when Mom found him dead as a doornail in the backyard. But when I'm left with the inheritance of over a dozen boxes of useless tapes, I begin to think he must have just went senile early. For as long as I could remember, he'd been collecting them, cassette tapes of every make and model, stuffed into shoe boxes and labeled from A to Z. They aren't just any old tapes, Matthew. These tapes are special. He'd always told me when I asked. But why are they special? I never got a straight answer from him, just a cryptic smile or wink, and I'll tell you when you're older. He would never play the tapes for us. Whenever we'd ask, he'd get this serious look on his face. The expression looked so out of place on him. He was usually so jovial. A party kind of man. A joking kind of man. I got older, and he never told me. He never got the chance to, I suppose. So here I am, stuck with a seemingly endless supply of cassette tapes. They're categorized in his ledgers, titled as incidents, labeled with various numbers, and given a nickname. It always struck me that they were labeled as a set, even with dozens of different brands coming from dozens of different places. It was baffling to me how Dad could go to any thrift store or Salvation Army and sift through the shelves of tapes and find exactly what he was looking for. He'd only find 1 or 2, if he was lucky, which he'd slip into the pocket of his old bomber jacket, before offering to buy me ice cream in exchange for joining him on his hunts. The boxes are stacked in my office, about 14 of them in total, all full of the tapes. Dad's cassette player sits on my desk next to the pile of ledgers, battered and scratched in places. A strip of yellowing masking tape with his name written on it pasted to the side. I pull my chair out from the desk and sit down on it heavily, letting out a long sigh. I take off my glasses and set them on the table, pinching and massaging the bridge of my nose. My headache has only gotten worse since this morning. Where am I supposed to put the boxes? I don't have any use for them. But I can't bring myself to toss them, not when I know they meant so much to my dad. My housemates have been understanding enough, giving me the space I need to process my father's death, but I can't exactly ask them to let me use the limited storage space we have to stow 14 boxes of junk. I lean back in my chair, leaning my head against my hand. I regard the stack of boxes like I'm trying to win a staring contest. Why tapes? Couldn't he have collected something more useful? like vintage toys or antique books. Something interesting. A conversation starter that didn't involve me explaining my father's unique kind of crazy that led him to spend most of his disposable income on tapes. After a long, quiet moment of giving the stack of boxes my best rendition of the Kubrick stare, I finally stand up, picking out box A. I set it down on the desk and remove the lid. They're just how I remember them, neatly placed in the cardboard box, in 2 rows going down the box lengthways. They fit snugly, without any space to shift or rattle about. I run my fingers down the row of tapes, making that pleasing zipping noise of nail against plastic. I pick out a random one and flip it over. Incident number 038, box A. Aurora Borealis, 1968. I sit back down and shift to face my desk. I fidget with the tape in one hand, tapping my thumb against the side of it as I crack open Ledger A. It's cataloged on the second page. Aurora Borealis, 1968. Confession of Sam Ketterman. Transcript from page 40 to page 42. I flip through, finding the page quickly, then turning my attention to the cassette player. The lid of it pops open, and I insert the tape with a soft click, watching the player whir to life with a sizzling crackle. Is it on? Okay. The man's voice is hoarse and tired. My name is Sam Ketterman. I was told to, record this tape by Dr. Leith, my therapist, as a way to process my trauma. There's a long pause, the sound of shuffling papers. This tape is in regards to the incident that occurred during my hiking trip in Alaska in 1968. He clears his throat. Phil and I were hiking near Fairbanks. It was a clear few days out in the woods, snow coating the ground and our bags heavy on our backs. It was just going to be a 2-day camping trip to hike out to where the light pollution wasn't so bad and we could see the stars and the lights. I was a little younger than Phil. I was in my early 20s then, and Phil was in his 30s. He was more experienced with the trails than I was, so he took the lead, helping us get up the foothills surrounding Mount Hayes. The first day passed without incident, but then I started getting the feeling we were being watched. When we were trekking that day, it got so quiet, just the sound of wind in the trees and the crunch of snow under our boots. When I brought it up with him, he said it was just in my head, but I didn't buy it. There was just something wrong to me. When we found the wrecked tents, we should have turned back, but we didn't. It's probably just a bear or something, or they left it behind. We made camp a few miles away from the wrecked tent, lit a fire, and got ready to sleep. I only got about an hour of rest before Phil shook me awake. I want to go for a walk, he said. Just a little walk to enjoy the lights. I agreed. They were really beautiful, flickering and shimmering overhead. The woods were calm and quiet, until they weren't. We heard the footsteps through the trees first. I was on edge, so I immediately turned to look. It looked like a person at first. A shadow. Phil spoke up first, calling out to it. Nice night for a walk, huh? He was always a friendly guy. I think maybe if he didn't say anything, he would still be here. It shambled out into the beam of Phil's flashlight and... The man takes a shaky breath. It hurt to look at. Even now it hurts to think about. It was like an empty snowsuit, but where the person inside should be, there was only light. Glowing, bright lights, shifting in color like the northern lights up above. I stumbled back and Phil stepped in front of me, holding his hands out as if he could stop it. I hate to say it, but I ran. I turned tail and ran as fast as I could back to the campsite. Hearing Phil screaming only made me run faster. I grabbed my bag, half full, leaving the tent behind. I didn't stop running until I passed out in the snow. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. Some hikers had found me, luckily before frostbite could set in. They never found Phil, just his flashlight, right where he'd been when it showed up. That's all. That's it. There's a click, and the tape is over. I feel a pit in my stomach as I close the ledger and set it aside. There's a morbid curiosity brewing in me. I'm hardly even paying attention when I pop open the cassette player, take out the tape, and put it back in its place in the box. I don't know what to say, other than that I'm going to have a lot of listening to do. A few of you showed interest in learning more about my dad's collection. It's a pretty formidable amount of tapes. I counted about 30 in each box, except for box N, which I suppose he was still working on when he, died. I've been avoiding going in my office, since it's where I'm keeping them, but I'm honestly too curious to keep it up. One of you suggested I perform a blessing before playing any more tapes. I'm not a religious guy, but my housemate Raph is, so I've borrowed one of his crucifixes, which now sits on my desk next to the cassette player. I did give the first ledger a read-through. At least, just through the names of them. Some are labeled with town names from around the States and Canada, but a lot of them don't have that information to go with it. An even smaller amount of them have addresses to go with them, but when I looked into them, they were all different therapists' office or psych wards. So then now what? I'm looking at the desk with the ledgers, my laptop open to Google Earth, and the cassette player. My head hurts just thinking about the stupid tape. Some of you suggested that my father had been living some sort of secret double life, but I just can't wrap my brain around that thought. By all accounts, my dad was a normal guy. A father of two living in a suburban neighborhood with his wife, happily married, working as a librarian. He was just normal, boring even, except for those tapes. I finally get up and walk over to the stack of boxes. I pick up box B, along with its corresponding ledger. I don't waste any time futzing around. Picking out a tape. Incident number 228, box B, backyard. I find the transcript. Incident number 228, box B, backyard. Testimony of Amara Walsh. There we go. Okay, Okay. It's a woman's voice, fairly young. I'm Amara Walsh, recording this statement as suggested by Dr. Umbra regarding my previous place of residence. It feels like she's reading from a transcript there, just like Sam. So, about a year ago, I moved into an old house with my boyfriend and his roommate. It was a pretty nice place, all things considered. A pretty home on a pretty big plot of land. My boyfriend and his friend are lawyers, and I work as a pediatrician, so the three of us make a decent amount of money. At the time, though, I wasn't able to work because of an injury I sustained during a car accident 2 weeks before. It was a broken arm and concussion. Nothing fatal, but enough to keep me from going to work for at least a little while. It was for the best, seeing as it meant I could spend the time making the house nice. The house was on a hill, backing onto an acre's worth of land for the backyard. There was a flower bed with lilies and tulips, an old bird bath, a rusty set of wings. It was like a fairy tale dream come true. And then my boyfriend and his friend had to go to a conference in Ohio, and I was alone for a few days. It wasn't anything I couldn't handle. I was an adult, but I got the feeling I wasn't alone. On the second night, I went downstairs around 11, I think, just to get an ice pack for my head. There's a window in the kitchen that faces the backyard, and on my way to the freezer, I passed by it. Something caught my eye out there. It looked like... I nearly jumped out of my skin as someone knocks at the door to my office. I quickly pause the tape and get up to check who's there. My roommate Dan stands in the doorway, holding a letter in his hand. "It's for you," he says, a slight quizzical tone to his voice. I rarely receive physical mail. I thank him and take the notes. He closes the door behind him as he leaves. I sit back down and hit play on the tape. Like a figure, almost. like a person standing in my backyard. I held the ice pack against my head while I looked out at it. It was like a person wearing a bed sheet, like a cartoon approximation of a ghost. It didn't move, just stood there, sheet blowing in the wind lightly. I reached for the light to the backyard. I flicked it on and it was gone. It must have been my imagination, just my nerves about being alone in the house. I decided to just forget about it and take my ice pack back to my room. I flicked off the light. I started walking back towards the stairs and then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. When I turned, it was... Her voice falters for a moment. It was standing at my back door. Its arm was lifted up from under the sheet. It looked... Makes me sick just thinking about it, but it looked like someone had peeled the skin off of their arms as if it were an orange. But it wasn't flesh. The muscles were rotting, turned gray and blackened at the fingertips, all smudged with dirt like it had just crawled out of its grave. I screamed. I didn't know what else to do, but my closest neighbor would be too far away to hear me. It just kept tapping. Not even aggressive, just tapping. I started to hear it breathe too, labored and desperate, like its throat was too tight to drag in enough air to keep it alive. I yelled at it, asking what it wanted, why it was there, but it just stood there. I couldn't take my eyes off it. I don't know how long I was standing there, staring at it. It felt like hours. Finally, I worked up the courage to step forward, and I turned on the backlight, and it was gone. It didn't give me any relief. I knew if I turned off the lights, it might. She lets out a choked noise. I don't want to think about it. I went back upstairs, leaving the lights on. I couldn't sleep that night. I didn't even think about telling my boyfriend. I knew he'd just call me crazy. We stayed in that house for 2 years, and every time I was there alone at night, I could hear it tapping. I am not crazy, doctor. The tape clicks off. The pit in my stomach is back and my head hurts, but the only thing I can think of is why. Why were these important enough for my father to pass them down to me? Why did he collect them? And why do I feel like there are eyes on me right now? Every time I come into my office, I feel it. Like the tapes themselves are staring at me. I feel as though the answer to why my father kept these things is just out of reach. Like if I could only remember, everything would be made clear. I take the cassette out of the player and put it back in the box, setting it back with the rest of them. I close a ledger as well, and then I look at the letter. It's a white envelope with an address and name written on the back. Birchwell Street, from Mr. Pleasant, head of the PSO Trauma Initiative. It sounds familiar, but the pit in my stomach only grows. I open my desk drawer and put the letter inside. I don't think I can handle reading it yet. If any of you know what that initiative is, I hope you'll let me know. I've been having trouble sleeping now. It's not surprising. Listening to people's trauma has always been tough for me, especially whatever kind of inexplicable fuckery is going on with those tapes. But it's less about not being able to sleep. Sure, it takes some tossing and turning, but it's more about staying asleep. I keep having nightmares. One's bad enough to wake me up in a cold sweat, but when I wake up, I can't remember what happened in them. All I know is that my hands are shaking and it feels like I didn't get any sleep at all. I suppose you could tell I was losing sleep. Seeing as I made a mistake in my last post when I was transcribing the incident, I didn't catch it. I was half falling asleep writing everything down. But that's not relevant, I don't think. I don't want to believe that the last thing I have of my father is somehow doing this to me. Some of you thought that maybe knowing my father's cause of death would help me solve whatever's going on. I figured maybe I could elaborate a little for you. My mother told my brother and I about it a month ago, and she'd recovered from the whole shock. She said it was at 6:32 in the evening. They'd just finished eating dinner, and my dad had gone out to the garden to walk around. He liked to do that when he was alive, just pace around the backyard, so it wasn't strange to her. When he didn't come in after half an hour, my mom got worried and went to check on him. He was laying on the ground face down, bleeding from the nose. His eyes had already gone cloudy, almost white, and there was a shock of hair turned white on his head. One that wasn't there before. His hands were covered in mud. She begged the coroner to do an examination on him, but my mom still refused to tell us what was wrong with him. Something was wrong with his brain, she said. Maybe a tumor or a hemorrhage, but I called her up to ask, and no matter what I said, I got nothing from her. I can't blame her. Still hurts. Try reaching out to the coroner. I looked more into that PSO thing. I found postings about it in a few old internet forums, and one or two on Reddit. Most forums were people expressing confusion about some peculiar advertisements they'd seen posted on bulletin boards in hospitals and universities, posted on telephone poles and sent with flyers in the mail. They were all described in similar ways. A picture of a silhouetted person laying back on Chase Lounge, titled in block letters with the question, "Something keeping you awake at night?" The irony of this title is certainly not lost on me. Usually under the picture was a paragraph asking all manner of strange, wide-sweeping questions, like, do you have something you feel like you can't tell anyone? Or, have other therapists turn you down? Underneath that, there was a phone number, an email address, and another set of block letter text proclaiming, "Don't wait, get matched with a therapist now." And finally, at the bottom of the page, there was that line of text stringing it to the tapes, courtesy of the PSO Trauma Initiative. I couldn't find any posts describing what this place was, nor could I find anyone who knew exactly how long the initiative had been going on. I think the earliest tapes I could find was from 1964, just a year after cassettes were invented. I figured I might listen to it now. It's from Box J, incident number 001. Box J, Hitchhiker, testimony of Franklin Boyd. The click of the tape being set into the player is almost comforting now. At least the oddness of whatever is happening is contained to a short tape, rather than spilling out into the real world like all this PSO stuff. I try to shake the thought out of my head and hit play on the tape. "Thank you again, Dr. Lacer. It's an honor to..." It's a quiet voice, meek, belonging to a young man. There's the sound of shuffling papers. "Right. I'll get on with it. I'm Franklin Boyd, recording this statement in partnership with the PSO Trauma Initiative, as suggested by Dr. Lacer, regarding a hitchhiker I picked up last summer." He clears his throat a little. "I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. It's risky to do it. You never really know what someone is going to do to you when you're out driving in the middle of nowhere, but I'm a pretty big guy. I've never fought once in my life, but I'm fairly imposing due to my height and body type." I digress, though. It was about 9:30 in the evening, and I was driving from Brooklyn to Rochester to see my parents over the summer break. It was a pretty warm night, but it was stormy out, so I had my headlights on while I was heading through a long stretch of woods. It was really quiet out that night, aside from the rain and thunder. I was listening to the radio to pass the time. I noticed a figure standing on the side of the road. He was a few inches shorter than me, wearing a gray raincoat and jeans, holding his thumb out into the road. I pulled over to the shoulder to let him in. You can't exactly blame me, right? It was pouring rain. The poor guy was gonna catch a chill. I asked him if he needed a ride, and he said yes. Climbed in the passenger seat, unzipped his coat, and pulled the hood back. He was a normal-looking guy, but he was pale in the face, a wild, queasy look in a pair of eyes that kept darting to look out the window, like he was being followed. "So, What brings you out to the forest this late? I asked. He whipped his head around to face me with that look on his face. Made me jump. I was going for a walk, he said. His voice was rough and shaky. I didn't believe him for a second. Where are you headed? I asked. He just shook his head a little and went back to glancing out the window. Anywhere. The nearest gas station, I suppose. I could do that. I prayed I would be there quickly. I didn't try to make any more small talk. I didn't try to speak or engage with him. Hell, I didn't even want to look at the guy. After what felt like hours, but was probably 30 minutes, I finally glanced at the guy. He wasn't peeking out the window anymore. He was staring out the windshield and up slightly at the clouds. There he was. He was bleeding from the nose. And it wasn't just a thin stream either. It was all over his chin and mouth, making a dark puddle on his shirt, but he didn't even seem to notice. He was breathing heavily, throat dry and hoarse as he did. I opened my mouth to tell him he was bleeding, but before I could, he grabbed my wrist. His hand was cold as ice. Pull over, he demanded. He didn't have to tell me twice. I did what he told me, and he let go. He slammed the door open and rushed out into the rain, thunder cracking overhead as he stumbled into the ditch and fell to his knees. He started screaming, laughing, looking up at the sky, yelling that he knew it was there, that it could kill him, all it wanted, tear him apart until nothing was left. You're going to think I'm crazy, but when he was shouting up at whatever it was, I saw the forest move. It was like a warp in my vision, like a mirage, a movement in the shape of something gigantic. It was like seeing something that was there, but that I wasn't supposed to see. The man screamed at the top of his lungs, and I saw him crumple forwards, hitting the ground with a splash as he laid there in the mud. The thing. It turned to me, and for just a moment I could see its open, glowing orange eyes, staring me down. I closed the door, and hit the gas as hard as I could, and didn't dare look back. I still think about that guy sometimes. He left a bloodstain on my passenger seat. Just a drop, but sometimes it feels like he's still sitting there. The tape clicks off, and once again, I'm sitting in a silent room. My head hurts again, and my hands shake as I take the tape out of the player. I feel sick to my stomach when I put the tape back into the box. I clench my hands a little before opening the drawer and pulling out the letter. I reach over to my cup of pencils and take out the letter opener. The paper slices open easily, and I unfold the pieces of paper inside. It reads as follows. Mr. Bradshaw, I would like to express my deepest condolences regarding your father's death. Deaths in the family are difficult to overcome, so I thought I might reach out to you on behalf of the PSO Trauma Initiative. However, there is a pressing matter I would like to discuss with you. Your father was in possession of some missing property of ours. As we understand it, he was making a collection of some very pertinent documents that are strictly confidential to those working at the initiative. We would like them back, Mr. Bradshaw. You are a smart man, so you can likely understand that keeping these would be detrimental to your health. Please respond to this letter as soon as possible to negotiate a drop-off point for these tapes, and perhaps schedule a session with one of our psychiatrists. I will offer for you to have this session pro bono, as a token of my appreciation of your cooperation. Regards, Mr. Pleasant. I fold the paper back up and set it back in the drawer. I eye the stack of boxes, feeling them stare back at me. Was that a threat? If they're confidential, what if I've listened to them? I don't know what to make of all this. I only know I'm not going to be giving those tapes back. I think I've only scratched the surface. If any of you can make heads or tails of this, I'd appreciate your help. My sleep hasn't exactly been improving since I opened that letter. If anything, it's only made things more complicated. Every time I try to get any rest, that stupid letter pops into my mind. That thinly veiled threat, all over some weird tapes. I tried to keep my mind off it for a day or so, spent some time with my friends and stayed out of my office. It brought me some relief for a little while. I was starting to think I could just ignore the whole thing. And then I went on a walk. It wasn't too long or anything, just up and down my street. You know what I found? Flyers, over a dozen of them, all just how I'd seen them described in those posts, down to the phone number. Felt like I was gonna be sick. They were posted on telephone poles, in the window of the convenience store, glued to walls and alleyways. They were everywhere, mocking me. I've lived on that street for 3 years, and never seen a single one of them, and yet, overnight, there they were. I took one down to bring it home with me and get a closer look. It's laying on my desk as I turn on my lamp. When I unfold the flyer and smooth it out, it feels as though the tapes are looking at it over my shoulder. The paragraph is different from the ones I saw online. Are you losing sleep? Do you feel like you can't tell anyone what's happened to you? Does your heart feel full of cold lead? Do you know what you've done? Do you regret ever accepting that gift? Do you feel them looking at you while you sleep? Do you remember what they look like in your dreams? Can you see them? Can you hear them? Are you listening? Are you listening to them? Do you wish you could just forget? Don't wait. Get matched with a therapist now. Call. I know why they left them for me. I know what they want. I know they meant to scare me, to intimidate me into giving them back, but my fear is crushed down by my anger. They're taunting me. It feels like they're laughing at me. I listened to what you all said. I bought enough cassettes to copy them all over, different kinds from different eras, just to get the variety of them right. Spent a small fortune on them. After reading that stupid flyer, I know what I have to do. It takes a long time to do it. I've spent hours doing it. Putting the tapes into a cassette deck I found at Goodwill, then the blank tape, copying it, and then writing down each of their titles. Some of you said I should keep the copies, but I'm too sentimental to do that. As strange as my father was, I loved him. He was a good dad. I can't just give the originals up, knowing my dad wanted me to have them. I moved the originals to the cassette racks my dad left me to store them in. Up until a few days ago, I was planning on just leaving the tapes in their boxes, hiding them in the attic or basement. They deserve better than that. While I'm pushing them away, my mind wanders back to thoughts of my dad. I remember when I was younger, I spent a lot of time with him. I always got along better with him than my mom. We were both a couple of Poindexters. We could spend hours just sitting in silence near each other, doing our own thing. Usually I would read, and he'd be writing in his ledgers. I remember one day when I was around 9. My mother had taken Toby out to a movie that I didn't want to see, so I was staying home with my dad. I was reading an old comic book that my dad had gotten me, and he was writing in his ledger when the landline started ringing. I hardly even looked up when he went downstairs to answer it. I only really started paying attention when he started shouting. I walked down the stairs, still holding my comic in my hands as I peeked around the corner into my kitchen. He was holding the receiver up to his ear, listening to someone talking on the other end. After a long moment of quiet speaking from the other end, his hand began to shake. He balled it into a fist and slammed it on the counter, making me jump. I swear to God, James, you stay the hell away from me and my family. Don't bring my goddamn kids into this. Whoever was on the other side, James, I guess. He laughed at that. My dad's shoulders stayed tense when he talked. You're a fucking monster, Jim. You should have left when I did. Now, look what's happened to you. His voice was cold and full of anger. He slammed the phone down onto the receiver and turned. When he saw me, he was startled. He asked me how much I'd heard. I lied to him. I told him I'd only been there for a few moments. He said he was sorry for yelling. I remember lying awake in bed that night. We lived in a forested area on the outskirts of town, so I'd go to bed to the sound of wind in the pines and owl calls. That night, I didn't hear any birds. If I focused hard enough, I could faintly hear the sound of whistling. Not like bird song, but like a person whistling. I didn't look out my window, but it felt like something was waiting for me to see it. I called the coroner yesterday, after another sleepless night. I dialed him up, hoping to get a little closure. When I told him who I was, Dr. Peterson's tone changed on a dime. A note of reservation in his voice, like he knew it was coming. He asked me if I was sure I wanted to know. Part of me wishes I didn't say yes. He said he'd never seen anything like it before. When he'd done an autopsy on my father, outwardly there were no wounds, no bruises, no punctures or bullet holes anywhere. In his stomach there was his dinner, only partially digested. No poison, no alcohol or drugs. It wasn't a heart attack. It wasn't a tumor or a stroke. His eyes were completely shut, like something had blinded him. But the thing that really causes death, supposedly, was in his head. When they opened it up, what greeted him was a pool, fleshy, pinkish sludge that was once my father's brain, like someone had taken it out and put it through a blender before pouring it back in. That's how he described it. He couldn't think of anything that could have done that. Neither could I. I slide the last cassette into place and let out a deep breath. Looking back at the waiting boxes of copied tapes, I take a seat at my desk and pull out my phone. It takes a moment of psyching myself up to key in the phone number on the flyer. There's a long beeping sound before someone picks up. Hello, this is Mr. Pleasant speaking. How can I? He doesn't get to finish before I speak. I have the tapes. He's quiet for a moment before letting out a little laugh. Good. I'm glad you came to your senses, Matthew. You have my address. Be there at 9:30 p.m. on Friday, and I'll take them off your hands. Will I have you? Did you want to schedule an appointment? You sound like you need one. His voice is dripping with a smug condescension. I swallow thickly, my throat feeling dry. No, I'm alright. I'll be there. I hang up the phone and set it down on my desk. I don't have the willpower to listen to a tape today. Once I get these PSO people off my back, maybe then I'll start listening again. Maybe then I'll be able to get some rest. Calling the coroner, talking to this place, have only left me with more questions than answers. If I could just pull all of this together, I could see the full picture. I don't know where to look next, but maybe you do. I need all the help I can get. Thank you. I'm sorry for leaving you all hanging for so long. I should get you up to date on what's happened in the days I've been missing. He wasn't lying. The building was just where he'd said it was. A tall office building on the 7th floor, past cubicles of people hunched over their desks talking smoothly into their phones. In the office with a brass nameplate on the door. He was there. He stood, looking out the window like he owned the city below, with his hands folded behind his back. Good evening, Mr. Bradshaw. Why don't you take a seat? He said without even turning to look at me. I did what I was told, finding no comfort in the blocky, unyielding armchairs that his office had to offer. He turned away from the window after a moment, taking a seat behind his desk and steepling his fingers. He was maybe in his mid-50s. There was something wrong about him. His smile lines a little too deep, hands too spindly, his teeth a little too white in his mouth as he grinned welcomingly at me. It was less like a greeting and more like a threat. I cleared my throat to speak, but as I did, he cut me off. "I'm so glad you had a change of heart. You really did the right thing by handing those over," he said. "I'm glad to give them back," I said, reaching into my pocket. I could feel the weight of the tape recorder in there, felt reassured by the click of the record button. I was curious about them. I didn't get the chance to listen to them when I was a kid. I just wanted to ask why they're so important. Mr. Pleasant smiled broadly, even wider than he already was. It made my skin crawl. I thought you might ask that. They're recordings of our patients' therapy sessions. Very personal. You know how it is. Client confidentiality and all that. Do you mind if I ask why you record them? He was quiet for a moment, smile deteriorating ever so slightly. Then he chuckled softly, sardonic and charismatic in a way that made me want to hit him. "You're a very curious man, aren't you, Mr. Bradshaw?" he said, reaching across his desk and adjusting a stapler. "It's just part of our special kind of therapy. We find it's easier for patients to forget their trauma through recording these tapes. In the past, our patients have found them very useful for processing their issues. In fact, I know you asked before, but perhaps you'd like to book a session for yourself." When he said it, my stomach dropped. I could feel sweat beating on the back of my neck. I opened my mouth to reply, but before I could, he cut me off again. "It really is a shame what happened to your father. All that work for a futile goal. It really is disappointing, isn't it, Matthew?" He didn't give me the space to respond, continuing as he got up from behind his desk and walked around towards me. "It's difficult to put myself in your shoes. Losing your father so abruptly and with such a strange cause of death." "How did he?" "You must be holding that weight with you, Matthew." I felt myself nodding before his words even registered. I shook my head, feeling stinging pain pushing in against my temples. "It's all right, Matthew. You're probably very stressed. Maybe it would help you to let your emotions out. I can get Dr. Ilio to come right away if you need." I got up to my feet quickly. I didn't even notice how close he'd gotten until he was resting his hand on my shoulder. When I looked at him, I could feel my ears start to ring. He had that smile on his face, wide and white, and too many teeth. I felt sick, like having him so close was hurting me. "You're bleeding, Matthew." His mouth didn't move, lips drawn tight over rows of snowy white teeth, too defined, too perfect, too straight, too perfect. I heaved weakly, managing to tear my eyes off him and down to my shirt, blood staining the fabric and dripping over my lips and chin from my nose. I stumbled backwards, shoving his hand off my shoulder and holding my head. The ringing stopped. His face was normal again. I swallowed thickly, staring at him. My throat felt like sandpaper. "I need to go." His smile waned again, but he nodded, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "I understand. Here." He reached behind him and picked out a small calling card, presenting it to me. "We should keep in touch. Any family of Julian is a friend of mine." I took the card. When I walked out of the office, holding a hand up to my bleeding nose, the room of cubicles was silent, all sitting facing the wall in front of their desks, holding their phones up to their ears but not speaking a word. I ran. I took the stairs, not wanting to wait for an elevator, rushing down the steps, through the foyer where I'd left the boxes of copies with the receptionist, and out the door. That was about as much as my stomach could handle, so it seemed. I threw up in the nearest bush as soon as I got out of the door. I'm not ashamed to say that doing it gave me some sense of retribution. My car wasn't parked too far away. I was thankful for that. Climbing into the driver's seat, buckling the belt, and hitting the gas. I drove until I was far from that place, until I was out on the outskirts of town, pulled over onto the shoulder of the road, and I broke. I curled in on myself, leaning my forehead against the steering wheel, breathing shallowly as my heart tried to climb its way out of my chest. It felt like being squeezed into a shoebox, like the world was too close around me, pressing the breath out of my lungs and making me panic. I've had panic attacks before, more frequently in the months since my father's death, but there were none like this. They never made my skin crawl and my stomach churn as badly as this. Never made my ears ring so loud I could hear the cars passing by. This couldn't be happening. This whole conspiracy, this whole delusional initiative, it couldn't be real. But it was. It was, and I jumped in head first without noticing how murky the water was. It took me a long time to calm down. I stayed like that, curled up in the car for almost half an hour. I remembered the recorder in my pocket and turned it off. It brought me comfort to know that what had happened had been documented. I drove home in silence, and all the while my frustration overcame my fear and anxiety. When I reached the driveway, there was a package on my doorstep, a padded envelope. I picked it up, taking it inside with me and locking the door. I tried to be quiet when I walked up the stairs to my office. When I enter it, it feels like home. It feels like the tapes there have been waiting for me patiently, knowing I'll be there eventually. I open the package. I'm not surprised to see it's a tape. Written on the side, though, it's not an incident number. It reads, "To my eldest." My hands only quake slightly when I put it in the player and press the play button. There's the familiar buzz of an old cassette tape. The click and a light shuffling. Is it? Oh, good. Perfect. My dad's voice, light and jovial. This tape is recorded for my son, Matthew Bradshaw, and only Matthew Bradshaw. I hope you're listening to this, kiddo. I wanted you to receive this tape after you got the other ones, so I hope my friend listened to my instructions. I want you to listen very carefully. If you are hearing this tape, then it means I'm already dead, and I failed what I'm planning on doing. In that case, I want to say I'm sorry. And I truly wish it didn't have to be this way, but it is. I don't doubt that you've taken the liberty of listening to the tapes. Maybe not all of them, but at least a few of them. You might already know about the initiative. These tapes are recordings of the victims of the PSO Trauma Initiative, or Paranormal, Supernatural, or Occult Trauma Initiative. This organization seems well-meaning at first, but their mission is to help patients with trauma from unexplainable or supernatural forces forget their problems. They pretend that they offer these services out of kindness or charity, but they are lying. The initiative is using those tapes and the traumatic events recorded on them for a different purpose. When patients at this initiative give their statements, they truly do forget their trauma. The cassettes hold whatever event they witnessed, taking a piece of their memory and leaving a blank spot where it was. The initiative is an elaborate cover-up for the existence of unexplainable and dangerous creatures that exist in and around our reality. Before I met your mother, before we had you and your brother, I was an archiver for that place. We were supposed to keep those tapes. Over the time I worked there, I became close friends with James Pleasant. He was higher up the food chain than me. I was supposed to just keep my head down and work, but he took a shine to me. I remember him telling me things that I wasn't allowed to know. Little things at first, but after a long while he got comfortable. He took me aside one day and asked me if I knew why we were keeping the tapes. Why we were really keeping them. I told him I didn't. He asked me if I could keep a secret. Of course I could. I still remember the smile he got on his face when I said that. He leaned close and whispered it to me. Food. I didn't understand what he meant, so I told him and he just laughed. It's food, Julian. Eternal food for something bigger than us. Bread goes stale, milk goes sour, meat goes rotten, but fear will never expire. He told me. If we feed it what it wants, if it lives forever, so will we. I didn't believe him at first. I thought he was crazy. But then I began to see it. Movement just out of the corner of my eye, just behind that tree, just behind that corner. A mirage, like something is there, but you aren't supposed to see it. It got to me and I knew I had to do something about it. Late one night, after everyone in the office had gone home, I went into the archives. There were thousands of tapes, all neatly tucked away into file cabinets with their transcripts. I tried to work quickly, piling them into trash bags and skipping town in my shitty van. I knew I couldn't keep them all in one place. They'd find me that way, and all my work would be for nothing. So I did what I could. I spent a year driving around the continent, leaving the tapes in small bursts in secondhand shops and Salvation Armies, pawning them off where I could, leaving a trail of cassettes all over, hoping it'd keep them at bay. Things were all right for a while. I settled down with your mother, got married, had you, and then I moved on to the second part of the plan. With the tapes spread out, I had pulled the rug out from under them, keeping whatever it is from forming, keeping them as distant from me as possible while I began to collect them again. I wanted to test my theory. I found one of the tapes closest to me and I destroyed it, burning the tape and crushing its plastic casing. The room went cold around me. For 3 days after, I didn't see the mirage following me. I was gearing up to burn the latest batch again. I do them in small increments so your mother wouldn't get suspicious. When Pleasant called, he threatened to hurt you and your brother, threatened to kill you both if I didn't stop what I was doing and give them back. You were too precious to risk. I stopped burning them. For a month, I stopped collecting them. And then I had an epiphany. I didn't have to destroy them. Just collecting them would be enough at first. You were always a curious kid. I remember how badly you wanted to know about the tapes. I kept collecting, knowing that eventually you would grow up. You would know how to protect yourself. When you moved away, I redoubled my efforts, writing the transcripts and leaving breadcrumbs for you to follow just in case I failed my plan. The plan was to burn them tomorrow night, to deal our first big blow to whatever this thing is. Clearly, since you're hearing this, I failed. The mirage caught up with me and, well, I'm dead. I need you to carry on what I've started. You know what you have to do. In 2 days, you will receive a box with the supplies you will need and the instructions to do what you have to. I know you can do this. I am so proud of you. I love you, son. The tape ends with a muted click. I rub at my teary eyes with the back of my hand, taking a shaky breath that rattles in my chest. I clear my throat as best I can and gingerly remove the tape from the cassette player. I know what I have to do now. I had trouble sleeping those nights. It's unsurprising knowing what I have to do. I want to hold on to my father's memory more than anything. He was always there for me, no matter what, so burning what I have left of him is painful. But it has to be done, so I'll finish what he started. The package arrived right when he said it would. It wasn't huge. A little smaller than a shoebox. In it were more tapes. My dad's old aviator-style glasses, a set of car keys including a labeled key to a storage unit, and a beat-up old journal. The address to the storage unit was scrawled on the bottom of the cardboard box. I loaded the tapes into the back of my car in boxes, and followed the address of the storage unit to find what my father had left me. During the drive, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. The number displayed on screen being from exactly who I'd expected. It seemed like the initiative wasn't keen on giving up yet. They could call me all they wanted, but I paid them no mind as I pulled into the parking lot of the rundown Excalibur storage units at the outskirts of town. The garage-like door rattled as I unlocked it and pulled it up manually, wincing at its squealing groan. It wasn't cluttered, just my father's old van from when he was young and 4 gasoline tanks. In a neat row next to the car, there was a Polaroid taped to the van, with an address hastily written on the bottom. It was a picture of a wide-open field, someplace nobody would look to find burnt cassettes. I was glad he knew a place. I wouldn't have known where to start. I shifted all of the cassette boxes into the back of the van, followed by the gasoline tanks and then me. The drive to the field was less like a drive and more like a funeral march. After weeks of torment and anxiety and sleepless nights, tonight it had to end. In some way or another, no matter how small, tonight was the night it would end. I thought about my father, thought about how the initiative had taken him from us, all for whatever thing they were serving. When I was in that van, listening to the gasoline tanks clunk against each other and the cassette tapes chattering in their boxes, I wasn't afraid of anything. For all I cared, I could die just like my dad, as long as I took down at least a portion of whatever that stupid initiative was with me. It was dark out in the field where I parked the van. The moon high above and the stars shining in the sky were the only things there to light the way. The tape stacked up nicely in a wide patch of dried dirt, a pyramid of boxes jutting up defiantly towards the sky. The tank was heavy in my hands when I poured the gasoline onto the pile. It felt surreal. I found myself laughing deliriously when I looked at the stack before me. I was staring down again, just as I'd done in my office. This time with no curiosity or fear or dread. This time with a knowing, superlative hatred that churned in my stomach and made me grit my teeth. I found a lighter in the glove box of my father's van, right next to his gun, that I held tightly in my hand with assured victory within sight, and... "I don't think you want to do that, Matthew." My hair had already stood up on end before he even spoke. I didn't turn to look at him. I didn't have to. Far away, across the field, his master was there. There in a way I didn't see but felt, like the drop of your stomach before the plunge of a roller coaster, but 1,000,000 times worse. "I think I do," I said. He walked towards me slowly and I turned only slightly towards him. It's not the man I met in that room. He smiled wider than I'd ever seen anyone stretch their lips, teeth like piano keys, or like the tines of interlocking forks. He was taller than I remember, stretched like taffy with hands hanging limp at his sides. "Just give them back, Matthew. You've come so far. Just give up," he hissed out, mouth not moving but beady black eyes squinting at me with unfettered malice. My hands were shaking when I reached into the pocket of my coat, pulling out my father's revolver and pulling back the hammer. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, ringing out like a cannonball. I thought I was going to vomit when it hit him right between the eyes. An easy shot. He was so close to me. He reeled backwards and I snatched up my lighter, frantically attempting to flick it on. Across the field, the creature wailed like the sound of rending metal and echoing fury. I flicked and flicked and flicked, and then Mr. Pleasant tackled me to the ground, sending my lighter bouncing away over the uneven dirt. I tried to roll over, feeling his arms wrapping around me like boa constrictors as his neck popped and cracked behind him. I screamed. Nobody would hear, writhing in his grasp until I could worm my way free. I kicked at him, slamming my boot into his face and rolling to the side. When I finally caught sight of him, I felt my ears begin to ring. He'd gotten even worse, where he was hunched over on the floor, grunting and panting, his neck ballooning and stretching up and outwards, thickening in the middle as his jaw unhinged, teeth like razors lined all over, as long, spindly, fleshy legs worked their way out of his mouth. I didn't have time to dwell on this horror. That was once Mr. Pleasant's. I had tapes to burn. I lunged for the lighter, stumbling to snatch it up. The cold metal in my hand was comforting as I righted myself on my feet and tried to flick it on again. "Matthew!" Mr. Pleasant roared. I didn't dare look, but I began to run, stumbling through the grass, away from him out of instinct, cupping my hand around the flickering fire of my lighter. I could feel blood running down my lips and chin. I could see the tall grass bend and bow, where the creature in the field ran, its glowing orange and yellow eyes staring me down with a hateful glee that made my stomach churn. Finally, the fire flicked on, bright and warm in my hands. I let out a triumphant laugh, making a U-turn to run towards the pile, before I felt long, clawed hands grab me by the shirt. Mr. Pleasant's body was hanging by a group of 6 spider-like, creaking, spindly legs, his long, squirming fingers gripping me tight as he laughed, voice echoing like there were 3 of him behind me. I wanted to cry. I was so close. I was so close. The creature came to a halt in front of me, laughing at me like a pack of hyenas. Mr. Pleasant's other hand shifted up, tangling in my hair and retching my head back to stare up at the creature's eyes before me, and the only way I think to describe it is, when you're a child and you're in a dark room, it's less the fear of what the room is and more the fear that the room is full of something you can't see that wants to hurt you. I hadn't felt that type of fear in a long time. It towered over me and didn't. It was there, and it wasn't. It was going to fucking kill me just by being in my line of sight. "Look at it, Matthew." The thing behind me howled with laughter, yanking on my hair and forcing me to look every time I tried to turn away. I could feel bile rising in my throat, blood cascading from my nose. I heaved, my eyes burning with pain, and in that moment I saw white. My ears stopped hearing, my eyes stopped seeing, from the burning hot pain that rose into my head, and there was peace for a long, deathly moment. It was a fig tree in the eye of the storm, a moment's silence before the worst came, and in that moment, I squeezed my eyes shut, and with a certain flick of my thumb, I felt the lighter ignite, and I let it fall from my hands. To say that those monsters screamed would be like calling a rainstorm a typhoon. The lighter hit the gasoline and the boxes went up in a split second. I felt the thing that was once Mr. Pleasant drop me to the ground and begin to convulse, shaking and shuddering and screaming as its legs began to crack apart, falling to the ground along with its master like a puppet with cut strings. I heaved, vomiting all red and shaking from head to toe. I couldn't bring myself to get up and run, so instead, I rolled over onto my back and looked up at the dark night sky. There was a seam in the sky, like someone had slashed a long, curved line in it. It opened, and I felt the breath leave my lungs. An eye as big as the world itself slid open, glowing orange with a pupil full of all the stars in the sky, lined with teeth that made up its mouth. It shifted to look down at me, blinking once before letting out a long, bone-chilling, whistling tone. I wanted it to kill me. I wanted to die so I didn't have to see it anymore. But it wouldn't let me. Instead, the monsters that lay around me began to crack and convulse even worse, screaming out in a language I didn't know, but could understand perfectly. They were forsaken by it. Their trust turned against them as they compressed and compressed and compressed, until there was nothing left of them but the scars they had left on my psyche. And then it slid shut, and the seam in the sky was gone. I lay there in the field for hours. I didn't move until the fire had burned away all that was left of those tapes, until knew that there was nothing around me for miles but grass and ash and my van. When I got to my feet, I was shaking, drenched in blood and sweat. All the stars in the sky were golden orange eyes, peering down at me with judgment for what I had done. The sound of the van door closing behind me is like a coffin being closed. I start up the car with a sputtering noise and fix my father's old glasses where they sit on my nose. I take a deep breath and my hands shake on the wheel, but I don't break. I don't cry or scream or panic, despite the pounding heartbeats in my chest. I pull out of the field slowly, trying to keep my breathing even though he isn't here to say it. I know that my dad is proud of me. Wherever he is, I wanted to thank you all for your help and your interest in my research. There's a lot of work ahead of me if I want to try to keep anyone else from succumbing to a fate like my father's. His journal should hold the answers to what I have to do now. There's a lot I still don't understand, and your input has been life-saving on a few occasions, honestly. But all I know is that I'm going to have a lot of driving to do. Humans were created to be social with each other, to go out for a drink, play golf with a friend, or simply relax in the comfort of home renting movies. I seem to be a clear exception to that rule. Even back when I had lived in the city, I never was very extroverted or a person who went out of their way to socialize. It didn't really appeal to me all that much. In school, my nickname was Beaver, due to the fact that I possessed an unusually large tooth hanging out in the front of my mouth. Long story short, I'm glad I finally got it removed. But I digress. I grew up skipping things like prom and bachelor parties. It's not that I'm completely inept or incapable of communicating with another human being. Rather, I prefer my time to myself. The peace and quiet helps my mind relax and process everything around me. Plus, I have a hobby that keeps me busy. Winemaking. Who doesn't like wine? I go to the supermarket in town every now and then, get the berries I need, drain them, and extract every drop I can to ensure the wine is as delicious as can be. I even have secret ingredients I refuse to tell anyone about. I don't want some leech copying my recipe. But when you live out here, in the middle of nowhere, that's pretty unlikely. There is nothing but nature to accompany you, when you're not keeping yourself busy anyway. I take great pride in my hobby. At this point, I've turned it into a side hustle. The people in town say I make the best wine they've ever tasted, but become frustrated when I refuse to tell them my process. I have to make plenty of trips into town for things like going to work, getting groceries, and obtaining the necessary things for creating my wine. For that specifically, however, I just make sure to get a lot all at once so the long journeys are far and few between. I don't hunt animals for food, even though my living situation might make you think the contrary. One morning I had awoken, my stomach grumbling for food as I rubbed the grog out of my eyes. The sounds of the birds chirping always soothed me as I got out of bed. I glanced at my phone on the table, keeping a gaze on the missed call notifications but not picking it up. I made a rule about not using my phone as soon as I woke up. I previously read online that it wasn't healthy for you. Cell service wasn't the greatest out here anyway, so half the time the dang thing didn't even work properly. Making my way to the kitchen, I opened up the fridge to grab the usual items to make breakfast, only to find that it was barren, although I was sure I could have restocked it recently. Damn, I immediately thought, now wanting to kick myself for my lack of preparation. I always kept a set schedule for everything in my life, not just this. It irritated me beyond belief when I did something to upset that. Nonetheless, I slipped on a pair of old jeans, a t-shirt, as well as a jacket and headed out to my truck, making sure to lock the front door behind me. I calmly walked up to the vehicle while whistling a familiar tune, treating the day as if it were just any other. But when I got to the driver's side of my truck, something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it. I turned to look around, seeing nothing but the usual trees, bushes, and rocks all scattered by the perimeter of the cabin. I darted my eyes left and right, trying to get this small feeling of unease out of my head. It was rare for me to be the target of this particular emotion. Felt like I was being watched, like someone or something was nearby, keeping its eyes fixed on my every move, but I had come out here 1,000 times before. Rarely did I ever let the quiet of the wilderness bother me. It was usually the polar opposite. I hopped in the truck, letting myself relax in the warmth of the seats. I chalked up my unease to me just being tired from having woken up less than 10 minutes ago. The drive to the store was just as quiet as the property. I didn't turn on the radio like I usually did to drown out the noise, because there was currently no noise to drown out. When I made it to the store, I grabbed everything I needed in a mad dash to get back home. As I said, I'm not much of a people person, and that place is filled to the brim with them. I prefer berries far more. Despite it being a small town, the population seemed to be increasing exponentially. It's almost like they're trying to make up for all the missing persons cases lately. On my trip back, I decided to take the highway, listening to music as I cruised along and enjoyed myself. I was only just about to hit the outskirts of town when the sounds of a police siren jerked me back to reality. You've got to be kidding me, I mumbled out loud, gripping the steering and getting off the highway on an exit. This right here was the last thing I needed. I was already in a hurry, and this would for sure delay it by at least another 10 minutes. I groaned as I led myself down a quieter road to pull over, hoping the cop would shut those frickin' sirens up as soon as possible. I came to a halt on a skinny suburban road, killing the engine and waiting for him to walk up to my window. I never had many run-ins with law enforcement before. I can't say that I'm a very risky person. I keep my head low, do what I need to do to make sure to stay out of the spotlight. No unnecessary attention. Soon enough, the officer tapped on my window. I sighed hesitantly before rolling it down. He kneeled slightly, allowing me to get an extended glance at his face. The officer sported a black goatee with a little bit of stubble on the sides. His build was more on the thin end of things. He wasn't underweight by any means, but I could tell he was once quite athletic, more so than now. A pair of aviators covered his eyes while a typical police uniform hat concealed his haircut. But even past that, I could tell he didn't like what he was seeing when he laid his eyes on me. He nodded his head in my direction, chewing a piece of gum loudly as he spoke. "Good morning," he announced gently, failing his attempt to fake basic courtesy. There was a slight tremble in his voice. I could tell. "Care to tell me why it is you're in such a rush?" I stifled my response. In the rush to get back home, I had forgotten to pay attention to how fast I was actually going. I apologize, officer. Just wanted to get these groceries back home. I've got ice cream in the trunk and it's really hot out here. Don't want the heat ruining it," I replied, keeping my demeanor collected. He grinned and let out a small chuckle, clearly amused by the simplicity of my situation, while also trying to maintain confidence. "Well, you're going 10 over, he told me bluntly. "That's pretty serious. I'm going to have to write you a ticket." Great, I thought. Just what I needed right now. The officer held out a hand just before asking, "Sir, would you please hand over your license?" Not wanting the situation to escalate any farther, I dug into my pocket, retrieved my driver's license, and handed it to him. He scanned it over for a few moments. I'll be right back. He nodded right before walking off at a brisk pace. Just as he was out of sight and earshot, I felt my phone begin to vibrate in my pocket. I awkwardly adjusted myself in the seat, reaching down to grab my phone. Once I slipped it out and laid my eyes on the screen, the caller ID was not one I recognized, but I picked up to humor myself anyway. "Hello?" I answered. "You're an idiot." The gruff, masculine voice on the other end erupted. "Who the hell are you?" I retorted, genuinely confused. "That cop? He's not a real cop. Jesus, you weren't even smart enough to ask for his badge. Listen, I'll explain everything later, but you've got to get out of there now," the man exclaimed. I only chuckled in response. The guy on the other end groaned, clearly frustrated by the fact I wasn't taking him seriously. "Fine, go ahead. Laugh it off all you want, but I'll be the one laughing when I find your corpse tomorrow." "How do you even know what's going on? Are you following me or something?" I asked rhetorically, taking a second glance at my surroundings out the window. "Just leave. Get out of that damn town. This isn't a joke. You've just got to trust me." "And why should I do that?" "Because I'm not some stranger, Beaver." Immediately my heart sank. I still wasn't completely won over though, but they knew my high school nickname. Sure, a bit of research could have helped them find that out, but how did they know where to look in the first place? "How did you know that?" I finally answered. "Because," the man stuttered, "that tooth, you finally got it removed midway through senior year. Even the teachers knew how much you wanted to take Stacy Dawkins to prom. You saved up a ton of money to get a job at JCPenney to pay for a limo. You preferred to work the night shift and always made sure you half-assed the job until they gave you a raise, which they didn't. So you quit in August of 2014. I stopped, completely speechless at the revelation the stranger had revealed to me. How did you know that?" "Like I said, I'll tell you later. Just get your license back and go," he commanded, not wanting to argue any farther with me. When I heard the footsteps of the officer approaching my car, I quickly hung the call up and put my hands back on the wheel as to not raise any suspicion, putting my foot on the gas as well ahead of my time. "You're lucky it's just a ticket," he says, leaning over and handing me my license through the window. But just after I grabbed it, I saw the officer subtly shifting his arm in a reverse motion, as if to reach for something behind him. I did as the stranger had told and immediately floored the gas, leaving the unlucky officer coughing up all the debris that had been kicked into his face by my wheels. "Hey, get back here!" He managed to get out in between all the hacking. I didn't listen or even look in the mirror. I kept going, darting off into the back roads on the edge of town, hoping I would lose him. Left, right, left, then left again. I took as many turns as possible trying to make sure he wouldn't be able to follow. The head start gave me a massive advantage. It would at the very least buy me some more time to find out who the caller was. Speaking of which, my phone began to ring again through all the chaos of my reckless driving. The same mysterious caller ID as before. I reached over and quickly tapped the answer button. "You're all good. You lost him, but you need to get home. Drive slow. I don't want you to lose the signal before I can finish speaking. We both know how crappy the cell service is near your place," he informed me, sounding highly displeased. "You shouldn't know that," I shot back. "Listen, on your way back, I need to let you know of some things. Number 1, do not go into your house through the front door." "And what's going to happen if I do?" I began, right before being interrupted by the stranger. "Will you please shut up and let me finish? Jesus. Number 2, park your truck at least a good 300 feet away. Do not park on the path or driveway. 3, go in through the exterior doors to the basement. I'll meet you down there." Before I could respond with any sort of input, the stranger quickly hung up, more than likely not wanting me to waste any more time engaging with trivial details. I didn't even get the chance to ask how he knew what was happening. If he was actually in my basement, something was wrong. But so far the stranger had only helped me. I prayed it would stay that way. I sped up on my way home, taking a second to look back every so often to confirm I wasn't being followed by the cop car, or anyone for that matter. But it felt like there almost had to be someone following me. How could the stranger be in two places at once? After going in circles multiple times, confusing myself and getting lost, I finally put my truck back on the right path to get to my house, although I was careful to make sure I kept notes of the area surrounding me. When I was nearing the area of the cabin, I stopped and parked my truck about 300 feet away as the stranger requested. I hesitated before opening the driver door, taking multiple peeks in each direction of the woods to make one final effort of being cautious. When I stepped out of the truck, a cold and bitter fall breeze passed through my jacket like it wasn't even there. I could remember it being much warmer in the morning. Regardless, I had to get moving. Once covering about 100 feet, I could immediately make out the shape of multiple humanoid figures moving around my living room. They were clearly searching for something important. I could tell by how vigorously they moved my furniture around. I crouched down as I walked along the dirt, doing everything in my power to not step on twigs or crunch any leaves. Every little sound was amplified by tenfold out here. Whispering was yelling, walking was running, and whistling was screeching. In my driveway sat two black sedans. They looked nothing like typical police cars or anything of the sort. The windows were tinted black, and I could tell the doors were reinforced and heavily armored. I got myself closer to the house, circling over to the right and keeping myself out of sight between the trees. The last thing I needed was those men in the house spotting me. I hunched over once I made it to the exterior doors that led down to the basement. I grabbed the handles, scrunching my face up as the cold metal bars made contact with my skin. I slowly pulled the doors open and lowered myself inside, quietly closing them behind me as I marched down the staircase. The light was already on. Nothing looked out of the ordinary. Not that I could see, anyway. "Hey," whispered a voice from behind me, causing me to jump as a reflex. "Christ!" I exclaimed, putting my hands up in a boxer stance. In front of me stood a man dressed in black jeans, a multi-piece suit and tie, along with simple black dress shoes and a pair of dark sunglasses covering his eyes. He was bald, his head almost shining through the dimly lit area of the basement. "Are you him?" I asked, despite already being pretty sure of the answer. He simply raised an iPhone and waved it tauntingly in front of my face, as if to mock my naivety. "You are just as dumb as I thought," he said. "You truly will listen to any and everything someone tells you just because they know a couple things about you, don't you?" I stood dumbfounded at what he was saying. He didn't look like anyone I had ever encountered before. "How did you know all that stuff? There's no way you could have." He held up a hand, stopping me mid-sentence. "I'm going to need you to come with us," he announced calmly, reaching into his front pocket and retrieving a gun. I put my hands up in surrender, but I maintained a scowl at the man. "Who is us?" I questioned. "You better tell me. I demand to know." He ignored my demand, instead raising his gun and motioning me to move forward. I did as told. He led the path as he marched towards the second half of my basement, the more recreational half, if you will. It was fitted with a TV, couch, and a cellar for the ingredients of my wine. A small hatch sat parallel to the couch, and it was opened, a potent scent of iron leaking from the expanse. There were more suited men similar to him standing around the open hatch to my wine cellar, looking down in it with nothing but looks of horror and disgust in their eyes. "I think I'm gonna be sick," one coughed, placing his hand in his elbow. They all turned simultaneously, glaring at me with nothing but a combination of malice and pride. the biggest of the suited men. A tall, burly man with long brown hair stepped over in my direction, looking me down and sizing me up. His disdain for me was unlike anything I had seen before. He led me over to the open cellar, that same obnoxiously powerful scent of iron traveling up my nostrils. I marched calmly towards the hatch, but the inside, I was going mad. It's nearly impossible to describe. "You're a sick puppy, you know that?" The beer-bellied hulk of a man gruffed. He grabbed my neck, forcing me to look down the hole at my handiwork. My beautiful handiwork. The blood-drained bodies of so many men, women, and children. Some were even families. I thought it would be better that way, to put them all in the same batch. They all laid there lifelessly with not even an ounce of the crimson liquid left in their veins. Their skin was shriveled up like that of a raisin. They looked almost zombie-like, so frail, so bitter, and emaciated. It was perfect. I always knew it would be a good batch when the berries looked like that after I was done. The agent who had called me over the phone grabbed a walkie-talkie from his pocket and held down the button before speaking. A $100,000 bounty for the Winemaker, primary suspect. We're heading back to base with him in our custody now. Thank God we got to him before the cops did. Once we collect the reward we're owed, he won't be our problem anymore. Then it's the courts. I turned, focusing my gaze on all the agents. Except this time when I looked at them, it wasn't fear. No pretend display of confusion or feigning of ignorance. I just smiled. I smiled as hard and wide as I could, my stained teeth protruding from between my lips. I needed them to be as proud of my work as I was. The time, effort, and man-hours I had put into my hobby was far too great to be unappreciated. I relaxed my hands as I spoke slowly and deliberately one final time. I wanted them so desperately to listen. I don't suppose any of you gentlemen would turn down some fresh wine. Maybe just a sip, perhaps. The most impactful thing about me is that I leave almost no impact. I'm not using the word nobody as a pejorative, such as how some people will synonymize it with being called a loser. I'm just stating the fact that I don't matter. There's nothing remarkable, good, or bad about me, aside from family members or people I happen to associate with often. Everyone always seems to forget about me. Ask anyone from my old high school, or even some ex-coworkers of mine, and they'll mostly respond with, "Who?" when my name is brought up. Everything about me is average, from my height, to my looks, to even my actions. My grades always sat at passing but were never excelling. Outside of marking me present, teachers hardly ever acknowledged me. Sure, I'd be picked sometimes if I happened to be raising my hand for a question. However, I'd never be called on. For the first 17 years of my life, I viewed my unnoticeably as a curse. I tried all I could to think of ways to get noticed, asking people if they wanted to hang out, starting a club, and even running for class president. None of that worked. Now, I don't want to give the wrong impression. This didn't depress so much as frustrate me. I wondered why no matter what I attempted, could I not get noticed. Then it happened during my last year of high school. I should mention at this point that there were two students who were the antithesis of me. Their names were Jacob and Kevin, and I happened to share some classes with them. It wasn't a secret that they weren't very fond of each other. As a matter of fact, they had a grudge going back since middle school. At least from what I had heard. For what reason? I don't know. What I did is that when it came to gaining the upper hand over each other, they'd try anything, from rumors to even vandalism. More often than not, fights would break out between the two. Despite all this, they remained popular among their peers. As it turned out, though, their rivalry would cost them greatly. What does this have to do with me? Well, I was an observer of sorts to the cost that they paid. It was one I thought I would be a part of. Now they happened to live relatively close to me. As a matter of fact, they were within walking distance of me. I happened to have a part-time job and would walk home when my shifts were over. Usually, this would be at night and I'd cut through the woods in order to get home faster. One night, I was on my way home when I overheard two familiar voices. Jacob and Kevin were also in the woods that night. Naturally, I was curious as to why these supposed rivals were alone together. I didn't want them to see me, so I made sure to stay far enough away. "I can't believe I actually let you talk me into coming out here," Jacob said. "I don't like this any more than you do, but can you think of any other way to settle things?" "No." "How do you think this is going to work, though?" "Because of this." Kevin held up a medallion. Although it was hard to tell, only having moon and starlight for visibility, it seemed to be made of gold. Both of them were also carrying their backpacks. "What's this supposed to do?" Jacob asked, turning it over while inspecting it. "It's for the game," Kevin replied. "Game?" "Yep. Did you bring it?" Both unslung their backpacks. From his, Jacob pulled out the trophy he won being on the basketball team. Kevin pulled out his football trophy. These were the main things they used as taunting points. "Now place it on the ground across from mine," Kevin instructed, placing his trophy down. Jacob did as told. Then Kevin, using a stick, began drawing something in the dirt. "What the hell are you doing? This won't take long. When it starts, none of us can leave." "When what starts?" "You'll see in just a moment." Having finished drawing, Kevin then placed his medallion between their trophies and began chanting something. Jacob observed this with some amusement. I guess he figured that if whatever Kevin was doing didn't work, he could at least enjoy him making a fool of himself. I didn't share this sentiment. Instead, I got a bad feeling. I wanted to tell Jacob to stop, but by then it was too late. I knew this when the temperature changed. "Hey, why did it get so cold all of a sudden?" That was a severe understatement. Only moments ago the weather had been warm. Now it was chilling. "That means it's working," Kevin explained. "Now, like I said, you can't leave, or else we'll both be in danger." "What? You never mentioned that." Jacob grabbed Kevin by his shirt. The latter seemed afraid. Not of him, however. Something was coming towards them. "Do not speak to them unless they speak to you." Before Jacob could ask for clarification, someone came out of the woods. This person, who could hardly be classified as such, was incredibly tall. I'd say they were over 8 feet. They towered over Jacob and Kevin, who were already at sizable heights themselves. A dark and worn robe covered them. "What the fuck is this thing?" I wondered. I found it to be so disturbing because of how it appeared. Only their hands and feet were visible, and they looked ancient. Mummified would be the right word to describe them. They had the appearance of always aging, yet never rotting away. As it approached Jacob and Kevin, I hoped to Christ it wouldn't notice me. "How many players are there?" they asked. Their voice was so hoarse, it was impossible to even tell what sex they were. "2," Kevin replied to them in a shaky voice. Jacob seemed ready to pass out on the spot, and I couldn't blame him for feeling that way. "Then we can begin. Who will go first?" What occurred next was this person asking them a series of deeply personal questions. For the sake of respecting their privacy, I am choosing not to list them or their answers here. The only one I will mention is the last one. So far, you two seem to be of equal value given the guidelines you've set for yourself. However, you two have made a grave error. "What?" Kevin asked in a panicked voice. "No, we did everything right." "Then answer this. How many players are there?" 2. I detect no deception in your answer. Unfortunately, though, it is incorrect. At that, my heart dropped. There are 3, they said, holding up 3 bony fingers. Kevin's eyes grew wide. What does that mean? Jacob asked him. That can't be, Kevin said, ignoring his question. We're the only ones here. At that point, I considered running. However, since I was technically a player, that meant the rules of the game would apply to me. No, they said to him. There is an observer nearby. They turned in my direction, looking directly at me. Reveal yourself. Not wanting to, but knowing that disobeying wouldn't be wise, I stepped into view. They were, even more, disturbing up close. You, Kevin said to me. Do you two know him? He goes to the same school as us. Were you listening the whole time? They asked me. I was curious, I replied in a shaky voice. I know I shouldn't have. I'm sorry. This is a problem. Although unintentionally, one of the rules of the game has been broken. Jacob and Kevin glared at me. But fear not, I can be lenient. How well do you know him? We share some classes with him. Then what I ask you next will determine if you two, or he, will leave these woods alive. Is that understood? We just nodded, and they pointed at me. What is his name? This is it. I'm done for, I thought. To my surprise, though, Jacob and Kevin were struggling with the answer. Give us another question, Kevin said. You said you know him. Therefore, this question should be easy for you. We never said we knew him that well. Then you should have specified that. Now answer. You have 10 seconds left. They each blurted out a name. Are either of them correct? I shook my head. They tried running, but found they were unable to. Why can't I move? Jacob asked, trying desperately to move. It was as if he and Kevin were both glued in place. With a snap of the robed one's fingers, they both lost their ability to speak. You leave almost no impression, correct? Yeah. Do you see this as a detriment? I thought about it for a moment. I used to. They just gave me a nod, then turned to Jacob and Kevin, pulling down the hood of their robe as they did. I was viewing the back of their head at this point. It was only a mass of writhing shapes underneath leathery skin that I could hear moving. I knew then that this person was far older than I could comprehend. The punishment must be delivered. What happened next was so disturbing that I suspect if I had been viewing it from Jacob and Kevin's perspective, it would have left me forever incoherent. Their heads split apart. It sounded so dry. If my eyes had been closed, I would have been unable to distinguish it from a piece of paper being ripped in half. I wish I thought to close them. If I would have, it would have saved me a lot of mental anguish. Since I didn't think to, I'm writing this down as a form of catharsis. What burst from their head were long, shadowy tentacles. Seeing them hurt my eyes because they appeared to be shadows, yet they somehow had a solid presence. They stretched towards my former classmates, enveloping them along with their backpacks and trophies. If they could have screamed, I think everyone in our neighborhood who were outside at the time would have been able to hear them. They were pulled into the tall person's head by these tentacles. What are you? They didn't answer at first. When they did, their reply disturbed me almost as much as what I had just seen. I can't remember. They walked deeper into the woods, vanishing from my sight. When they were gone, I leaned against a tree, breathing heavily. As I was catching my breath, I caught the glint of something. Kevin's medallion had been left behind. Search parties tried finding him and Jacob for months. I felt bad that their efforts would be in vain, and that I was partially responsible for their fates. I took the medallion home with me. I found that there was one carving on each side of it. One contained the face of presumably the tall one. The other had an eye carved into it. Seeing this made me relieved I never saw their true face. I still have the medallion. Sometimes I'll stare at it and reflect on that night and what saved my life. I don't see it as a curse anymore. In fact, I'm glad to have it. My grandmother passed away 3 weeks ago from her battle with cancer. It wasn't unexpected as she had lived to the ripe old age of 94. We had a very small gathering to remember her since COVID is still ravaging the world. Only 5 people showed up, and I was her only blood relative there. My parents didn't come since they were living overseas for work. The rest were her old church friends. I spent hours with the old ladies learning so much about my grandmother that I never knew. I didn't know her that well since I lived in a different state growing up, and we very rarely took trips out to see her. She had left me her house and her will, along with everything in it. I was excited about it due to it being worth over $1 million. I was also filled to the brim with antiques that might be able to sell for a good deal. I decided to move into the home and abandon my couch surfing expedition. The first week was awesome. I had a ton of fun going through all her old photo albums and digging through her ancient wardrobe. She still had her clothes from when she was a schoolgirl. I also found her old wedding dress that she wore back in 1950 when she married my long-past grandpa. After a few days of fun, I grew bored. She didn't have a TV or a computer. All she had was a small radio and her craft supplies to pass the time. I'm not a crafty person, so I had ignored that room. Later, after I explored the entirety of the rest of the house, I bit the bullet and went into the craft room. It was the only room that wasn't dusty. One wall covered in yarn and fabrics that were stacked up onto brown shelves. She had a large desk that housed an ancient sewing machine and fabric from what I had presumed to be her last project. I spent about an hour going through all of her projects ranging from clothing to blankets. It was nice to see her creativity and to get to know her that little bit more. I could tell from her projects that the ones that were completed in her later years weren't as neat or done with a precise hand. While I looked at her quilts, I heard a strange tapping noise. Tap, 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 tap. Intrigued, I looked around the room for the source. Tap, 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 tap. I listened and followed the tapping to her craft closet. I swung open the door and saw the shelving full of supplies as well as discarded projects. Compared to the rest of her orderly craft room, her closet was a hot mess. The ground was covered in discarded fabrics, and the clothes that hung within were eaten away by moths. Tap, tap, tap. I saw a string hanging from the ceiling of the closet to pull down the stairs to an attic. I was confused because I didn't know she had an attic. I grasped the string and pulled it, but it didn't budge. I bit my lip and pulled once more, grunted in the process, and it fell with a loud creak. The stale air hit me like a baseball bat. I coughed and covered my face with my shirt. I took a step back to gather myself and then pulled the rest of the ladder out. It hit the floor with a thud and I climbed up. The stairs groaned under my weight and dust covered my hands while I climbed. Once I was in the attic, I looked around for a light switch of some sort but didn't find any. I didn't want to stumble around up there as I was already clumsy enough and pulled out my phone, turning on the flashlight app. I scanned the room and took in my surroundings. Moldy boxes piled on top of each other, discarded clothes littered the floor, and old paintings laid against the wall. Everything was covered in a thick spider web, more than I have ever seen before. I hoped out loud that she didn't have a spider problem because I didn't want to deal with it. Tap, 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 tap. My flashlight beam hit an old couch in the furthest part of the room. It was green with a floral pattern and cigarette burns. It wasn't pushed against the wall and had some space behind it. I thought that the tapping noise was old pipes settling or the wind. I walked closer to the old couch and flashed my light behind it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a large black fuzzy thing scurry out of the light. I screamed and jumped back, tipping over an errant cable, and landed right on my ass. I dropped my phone and heard a crack. Hello there? I grabbed my phone and stood back up. My hands shook. Hello? I'm so happy that we finally get to meet. What the fuck? Who are you? An old friend of your grandmother's. I've been looking after the house since she passed. I took a deep breath and ignored the foul stench that entered my mouth. No, you're not supposed to be here. I'm calling the cops. I screamed into the darkness and swung my flashlight around the room. They won't be able to help you here, my child. I backed up, and as I turned to climb back down the stairs, it revealed itself. It was large and black with a blue tint. Its 8 deep black eyes stared right into me. It felt as though it was looking into my soul. Oh my God, what the fuck? I screamed at it. I backed up against the wall, frozen in fear. I'm so happy to finally have some company around here. I loved your grandmother to bits, but I have been quite lonely. It will be nice to have another person to spend time with. My body shook and my mind raced. It crept towards me slowly. Each foot that hit the ground made that same tapping noise I heard earlier. I was breathing so quickly that I felt like passing out. I clenched my broken phone and shone the light right into its face. It grimaced and looked away. I took that moment to jump out of the attic. I landed on the craft room floor belly first. Jesus Christ, I groaned. I rolled over and rubbed my head. Tap, tap, tap. I screamed and stood up onto my feet. The spider bounced on top of me from the attic. Its body heavier than I anticipated, and I fell to the ground once more. I dropped my phone as the spider pressed my shoulders back into the wooden floor. I tried to push its furry body off of me, but it was too heavy. Stop, my child. Its eyes started to glow a bright neon green and illuminated the dark room. My eyes widened, and I tried to look away, but I felt compelled to stare into its eyes. It leaned back onto its hind legs and started to rock back and forth. Its front legs released my shoulders and waved in the air in a circular motion. I lay there entranced by its eyes, unable to move. A low, rumbling noise radiated from its abdomen. It slammed its body onto my chest and bit into my shoulder. I screamed and shook beneath it. My head grew dizzy and my limbs went numb as it drank. Webs shot out from its abdomen and covered the craft room wall with its silky threads. For a brief moment, I was able to clear my head. I grabbed a hold of my phone and hit it as hard as I could in its eyes. A loud piercing wail erupted within it. The noise shook the walls, and my grandma's craft supplies fell from the shelves and onto the floor. It stumbled off of me and jumped back several feet. I stood up and ran as fast as I could out of the house. I haven't been back since. Once I got to safety, I realized that I had left the front door wide open. I'm sorry for releasing the creature from its cage. I looked at that damn phone every day. At one time, it was as yellow as the sun, but from all the years surrounded by cigarette smoke, it's now almost like a faded mustard-colored yellow. I know I'm the only one in my zip code that still has a rotary phone, but I have it for only one person. I wait for a phone call. A phone call that I haven't received in close to 10 years, but I know is coming any day. The phone call that will warn me that they are coming. The ones that I owe millions upon millions of dollars to. The ones that I thought I could just win one more game to be even. I was a high roller, and at one time, I lived the high life, but for the last decade, I've been hiding out in this dank 1970s, horribly decorated house, knowing the one person on the inside of their organization would tip me off if they found me. You see, he's my father, and though he's close to 80, he's still my father. A father who didn't know me growing up and only found out through Ancestry.com that the fling who is my mom unknowingly got pregnant and learned that his son is a degenerate gambler. To make things worse, I live alone with my 13-year-old daughter Grace, whose drug-addicted mother left when she was 9. I know this organization and what it's capable of. I've made a fool of them, and they will kill me and my daughter in a heartbeat if they found out where I live. I was fortunate that my father gave up this place to hide out. It was actually his mother's, who was my grandmother, that I never met. He told me the organization will never look at this house because they don't know our relation. My father has done well for himself. He has many soldiers that report to him, and my father reports to an underboss. But as high as he is, and given that he is a made man, they will also kill him if the organization finds out he's hiding me. I had done too much and shamed the organization's reputation. My daughter's name was once Sophia, and I had to train her to go by Grace, which is really hard for a 6-year-old kid to do, especially considering that her crack-addicted mother left us a few years later. I guess there's an argument who is a bigger degenerate between my gambling self versus my crack-addicted wife. So I sit in this old house every day, and I never leave. I get everything delivered to my front door. Grace goes to school every day and is a good student. I warned her that we might have to move any day if Pop ever called me. My father won't come to this house with me here. Once a week, Grace goes to visit my father at his house. It's a pretty elaborate setup where Grace purposely walks the long way to the subway to see him. She doesn't know everything regarding my situation, but she knows that if she doesn't follow Pop's directions, then her and I will be harmed. So every day, I watch the same damn TV programs. I can't even go outside because if one person recognizes me, then I'm done, and I have to be close enough to answer that phone. That phone will work under just about any circumstances. It will last another 50 years if need be. I know if Grace was 18, my father would just have me killed for her sake, but with his emphysema, he doesn't have long to live, and she doesn't have anyone else but me. But I know she would be better off without me. All I am is a ticking time bomb, an unpaid debt to the most savage organization in North America. But if I don't leave the house, they won't find me. I keep telling myself that. My poor mother knows what I have done, and she knows that she can't ever see me again or Grace. I eventually hang out in the kitchen or in the living room where I can hear the phone ring. About once a week I have a mini heart attack because a telemarketer will call. I usually yell and scream at them, and I tell them I'm on every do not call list, but they still call. I sleep on the couch every night. I've been doing it for so many years that I'm used to the couch. I'm sure my grandparents purchased the couch sometime in the 1970s with its Halloween orange faded tone, which feels like wool against my skin. I could hear the phone from upstairs, but I don't want to chance it. I don't want Grace to wake up with a knife to her throat, so I sleep on this uncomfortable 1970s couch. My father could upgrade the couch, but in a way, it's almost a punishment and I deserve it. As long as he takes care of Grace, I'm fine with whatever. I'm a different person now. I don't have to gamble 10 times a day anymore. I don't have to gamble on Sunday football all day, then watch international soccer and gamble on sports clubs that are probably fixed to win or lose regardless. I'm just not that person anymore. I feel like I was when I was 16, when the world meant something more than a quick $5 bet here or a double or nothing there. I feel like there's so much more to this world that I'll never have a chance to see. I sometimes wonder if prison would be any better, because then at least I would get to socialize with others, but if the organization didn't get to me on the inside, then one day of my release, they would off me. But I have to do this for Grace, because this life isn't for me anymore. I chose my lot, and I have to live with it. Every time she comes through the door, that's my sunshine, and every time she leaves for school, then I know she's growing. Sometimes I have panic attacks, and I have to remind myself that nobody knows I live here, and Grace is just a child of an unknown tenant whose landlord just happens to be a capo. The worst part is I can't even watch sports anymore. What the hell is the point of January without football playoffs, or March without basketball playoffs, or February without the start of baseball spring training? I live in a living hell. I'm just trapped in here all day. If Grace brings one of her friends home, I hide in my room so they can't see me, but I make sure I can still hear the phone. I've become an expert on World War II movies. I know everything from the battle to the Bulge to D-Day. I've seen every black and white and modern day war movie. I guess there's no harm in wars because the winners and losers are already known, so I can't gamble. Most of the times, Grace will just see me for like 2 minutes out of the day. She's busy with her own social life. I cook her whatever she wants, and she likes me for that. We can't go shopping, so my father just gives me his Amazon card for her. He's really specific for me not to buy anything for myself, and I wouldn't cross him. Even as old as he is, he has that certain toughness. He was a Marine in the Korean War. You just don't cross him, but in the Sicilian tradition, family comes first, and that's the only reason why I'm alive. Grace is actually the only reason why I'm alive. My father knows I'm a dead man. When he dies, he knows I'll be killed. My father has been creating a smokescreen for me, and any credible leads on my whereabouts, he just squashes it. I'm just a headache for him, but there's no alternative for him because of Grace. I could tell every week that my father was getting closer and closer to death because on Grace's description of him. Then one day I heard that sound that haunted me for years. The sound that would wake me up at 2 a.m. in the morning, but to find out it was just a nightmare. It was that damn yellow phone ringing. So I ran from the couch to answer the phone. I reluctantly picked up the phone, and with no greetings, my father gave me an address to meet him at, this old abandoned warehouse. This is the most horrifying scenario because I knew he was going to have me whacked. But what do? I can't refuse to go. I haven't left the house in years, so just the thought of that frightened me. I had no choice, so I got on the subway and headed towards the abandoned warehouse by the river. I know he made an arrangement for mine and his life to save Grace's. It was the only logical solution, considering that once he died, I couldn't support her. But taking the subway to my own execution to save my daughter didn't make my nerves feel any better. I was given no information, but logically, Grace would just live with my mother and my father, and I would be tortured and mutilated. It has to happen. If not now, then her and I would be essentially starved out of the house. As I sit on the subway, I look at all the beautiful houses and trees and remember what the world once was. It kills me that I can't even say goodbye to Grace, but it's for the best because I would start crying and she'll remember me in that state for the rest of her life. I know my stop is close. I wish the subway would go slower, but the inevitable is approaching. I hear the automated conductor announce the next stop, and I know I have to see myself as a piece of meat void of all feelings. Like a pig who is being trucked into the slaughterhouse. I cause enough grief and potential harm onto Grace, and this is one of the last things I can do for her. I know I only have to walk one more block. I see the warehouse. My mind blocks out the weather because it just doesn't matter. If I get hyper or hypothermia, it just doesn't matter because in 30 seconds some olive-skinned man with a 5 o'clock shadow is going to shake my hand and rip out my bowels. I see 4 cars parked outside the warehouse and I head for the only door that I can see. I take a deep breath and then I step inside. I close my eyes briefly as I open the door almost to brace myself for impact. As I open the door, Some man who looks to be about 46 with some kind of unknown accent, maybe Norwegian, says to me, "I'm Special Agent Olsen with the FBI, and we're here to offer you safety in the witness protection program." In the corner of my eye, I see my father, and I know that Grace and I will be safe.